Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of the Visual Studio Remote Office Hours. My name is Mads Christensen, and I will be with you for the next hour or so. And today is a very, very special topic because this is about something new and I think very, very interesting. And it has to do with how we set up our environments because, as you know, that can be really tricky if you're starting a new job or if you're getting a new laptop or a new machine or something like that. Making sure everything is installed so that you can be productive again and you can start working on your Visual Studio solutions and, commit your code. It can take a while, right? Do you remember everything you need to install? All the different components that's required by the runtime, all the SDKs for your development needs, and so on. So I'm very excited to talk about something new that we can use. And here to tell me about it and teach me about it is no other than Andy Sterland. Hello, Andy. Welcome to the show.
Hey, man. It's great to be here. The most melodramatic introduction of my name ever, I think. So really appreciate that.
Yeah, and pretty bad English there, too. So you get that for free.
It's better than mine. It's certainly better than my Dutch.
I wouldn't know. I'm Danish. So.
Oh, there we go. Sorry. See, first boo-boo.
Yeah, that's okay. I won't hold it against you. So, well, Andy, thank you so much for joining us because I know you've been working on this thing called DevInit. But before we get into all that stuff, do you mind just giving sort of a brief introduction to who you are, what you're doing at Microsoft?
Yeah, so as you said, Andy Sterland. I work in kind of two areas in Visual Studio. One area is all around diagnostics. So when you use Visual Studio to debug or profile, if that's in the little diagnostic tools window while you're debugging, or the separate profiling tools from the Alt F2 menu, the profile menu, those diagnostic tools. And the second area I work in is all around acquisition setup, really, like how do we get Visual Studio set up and installed, and how do we update it, more importantly, so that you can get the latest features and the latest bits. And more recently for Codespaces, so if the audience hadn't heard of Codespaces, we have this new product which is really about like a remote development environment where there's a computer VM up in the cloud that executes build operations and runs your application and things like that. And so we've been working a lot recently, or I've been working a lot recently, on how to create those environments so that they can be automatically provisioned, so they can scaled, and kind of solving some of those problems you were talking about earlier, where as you're new to an environment, you git clone of repo, and the first thing you want to do obviously is build and run the application. And sometimes that can be tricky. You've got to acquire tools. There could be a set of manual instructions, a markdown file, things like that to follow. And so really we've been working on a tool called DevInit, like you mentioned, which is all about trying to automate that process so that anyone can walk up to a repo, not just clone it, but also get their, in this case, a code space up to the point where you can execute and run code, run that application in your environment so you can debug it and work on any feature that you'd like.
All right. So you've been doing diagnostics for a long time, right? The debugger in Visual Studio.
Yeah. And despite getting your language wrong, I've known you for years too.
Yeah, right. We go back. But you've been the diagnostics PM and then lead PM, right? You're actually running the whole diagnostics team, and now you're running the whole acquisition team as well. And so any questions for Andy, whether it's acquisition or diagnostics, just keep them coming.
Yeah.
In the chat, right? So if you're watching this live on Twitch or on YouTube, then feel free to ask any questions as we go along. One of the big things that you were mentioning here was like if you just want to clone a repo, like let's say I have an open source repo on GitHub and you clone it, you might not have what's required to actually build and run this repo of mine, and so. Yeah. What are some of the problems that people face today? Like not just the problem that, hey, it won't run, I need to install something, but what are the underlying issues that we're trying to solve here?
Yeah, you can think in some ways this is a problem we helped create. Like with Visual Studio, one of the nice things about Visual Studio is that you install Visual Studio, you choose your workloads, and you can choose a project, and you can press F5, and it all works. Like you didn't have to do anything. You didn't have to configure or set up anything, especially these days where the installation is fairly straightforward. The downside of that is that Visual Studio has gone ahead and made some assumptions for you. So it's chosen versions of .NET to install, it's chosen versions of C++ to install, specifically the libraries and the runtimes and things like that. So like, that's great. Like, it gives you a really great onboarding experience. But later on, when it comes to maintaining that application, like this could be years down the road, or sometimes even case like up to a decade and longer, depending on the application, those choices that Visual Studio made are no longer applicable. Visual Studio has moved on, the tools it's bring along have moved on, but perhaps your app wasn't ready to be brought along. And so that's when you start first really encountering this friction of like, hey, it used to be the case that I just installed Visual Studio, and for a lot of simple apps that don't have complex dependencies, that's all you needed, because Visual Studio brought .NET, it brought C++, and then just later you got burnt as the versions of Visual Studio moved on. So a classic example now is .NET Core. .NET Core has a much shorter life supported for a much shorter period of time at Visual Studio, which has around 10 years, 5+5 of support. So during the lifespan of Visual Studio, the version you started with .NET Core might have actually now be out of support, even if it's a long-term stable version. And so this can cause friction in terms of acquisition. You can't depend upon Visual Studio to be the one solely installing your stuff. And then, of course, Visual Studio was never the thing for everything. If you had a more complicated application, you might have brought SQL Server. Some people use SQL Server locally even, or you might have brought another dependency, like another third-party library or an API, or even a service. Something is, perhaps it's a Windows service, like IIS or MSMQ, the messaging service, or a third-party one like RabbitMQ and stuff like that. And so, you've got simple applications that get that depend upon Visual Studio to manage their dependencies, and that doesn't work in the long term. And then you have these applications that simply were never managed in a single place, and they relied on you as a developer following instructions, going to your website, downloading MSI, and running and installing that MSI. And so, like this created this place where it's kind of hard in many cases to get set up. And there's many solutions for this today out in the market. Like probably the best, most popular example is something like Docker. Docker has a great story for both encapsulation and isolation of the application itself. They run in a highly isolated manner where they can't interfere with other applications. They also have a great way, with Docker files and all the Docker image galleries out there, of bundling dependencies. You can have multiple Docker images representing, multiple parts of your application, like that SQL Server and the other thing. And so in some situations, like if you're building a modern, ASP.NET Core application that can be containerized and run in that way, you have a great story. But DevInit is really trying to, for those people that don't have or can't use Docker, Docker obviously is great for services and specifically .NET Core or other languages running on top of Linux. But for the Windows ecosystem, especially for graphical, for applications, client applications, there isn't a similar story of how you define the scope of your application, both in terms of the runtime it depends upon and all the other dependencies. So really, DevInit is just trying to fill a little niche to help developers do something which is common today, which is write down a README file or write a script even sometimes. DevInit, we want to make that easy, so it's much easier for a broader range of applications to benefit from some of these nice solutions that exist for more modern applications.
Right. So you're touching on some different issues here, right? So one is the README file, or I worked in companies where there was an internal wiki, and it would be up. It would tell you what you need to do to set up your environment and stuff like that. So whether it's a README or a wiki file, and they kind of just go stale, right? They're not up to date. They're not checked into source code. They might have been written originally by someone that's not even there, and then it hasn't been updated, and the information is not wrong. And you end up sitting with someone that's got to take almost a whole day out of their calendar to help you set everything up, do all the settings, do all the environment variables, do everything like that.
Yeah, and this is something we've heard from customer research, from talking to developers, is really around that, when they start a new project or a new job, it can take a day to set up, easy half day, depending on the environment and the company, but just getting all that knowledge, because it's very transient. You go through it once traditionally, you set up your machine for your job and your project, depending on how you're working, but you don't do it every day. So it might be painful, but you live for it once. But with like things like Codespaces, we're provisioning environments in the cloud, so we're provisioning them much more frequently. And obviously, we want it to require no manual setup, because it's very difficult to deploy cloud resources if they're going to require manual, like a person to go through and install stuff and manage stuff. That kind of like defeats the point.
Yeah, right. So you want something that's easy to reproduce, and you want something that's completely isolated. That was another thing you were mentioning, which was this whole idea of like freezing your development environment in time. We've all probably had to deal with like legacy apps, and you don't touch them that often. Maybe you have to maintain them a little bit. So maybe once, twice, 3-4 times a year at the maximum, you have to touch that code base. But your entire development machine is like always on the latest and greatest, and you don't necessarily have this old, it could be like an old ASP classic app, like VB, whatnot, right? That you just maintain. And the problem was always that you have to kind of set up your environment every time you have to make a change. Just everyone is fearful of making any code changes, because can you even run the app? Like, just imagine you don't even know how long it's going to take you to change a comma, because in order for you to test that comma you changed, you have to be able to run and test and everything.
Yeah,
that's scary, right? And so how do you? Is that So how does that problem? I guess, how big is that problem, and what are we doing there?
It's sure a huge problem. I was just having a nightmare flashbacks to having worked on IE many years ago, and one of the challenges there was you'd have to have a security fix. You'd have to go down to like IE5, which is decades old at that point. It was you could either build tools, and all the tools for it couldn't be ran on corporate machines because they were out of compliance. They're just so old. So yeah, there's definitely this thing we're researching around this space, which is right now Codespaces is clearly focused on like .NET Core and C++ applications, but there's a lot of research going into that sort of niche, like you're kind of alluding to, where you work at a large enterprise, and perhaps there's several applications that have existed for years, if not decades at this point, or longer, and they don't get much work on them. No one works on them every day. People add a small feature, make small bug fixes, but because all the knowledge of those applications is kind of lost, there's not someone working on it every day, 24/7, or certainly not a team of people working on it. And so this is like a kind of a niche we're exploring, of maybe one of the solutions that could be great here is just this way of like you define your environment, and then like you said, it's kind of like archived, or it's kind of like described, so you can rehydrate it later when you need to work on it, and you can build it and run it, and then when you're finished with it, you can just put it back on ice for a while longer. So this is certainly something we're thinking about for Codespaces, is how those sort of applications can benefit from this system, because those applications have some of these problems the worst. Just because the way technology is developed, that this sort of like having this like idea of infrastructure as code, or some sort of, how should we say, like declarative, or some sort of even programmatic way of defining an environment, has not always been a popular thing. It's historically, I guess, relied on a lot of people to do stuff. Obviously, like with services and the need to create environments dynamically and provision cloud resources and stuff, that's kind of changed the world a little bit for modern applications as well. But there's a lot of applications that don't fit that paradigm. Like you can't run you can't easily run something like a game from a container or anything.
Yeah, right. And so a lot of people, I guess, or some people today, they have like elaborate systems of VMs that they maintain. Some of them might be in the cloud, some of them might be on-prem, some of them might be on their own machine. Yeah. And if that person leaves or get hit by a bus or whatever, then that disappears, right? That tribal knowledge that is so crucial, like, just vanishes.
Yeah, and even if it's not just because it's so localized into one or two people, it's just people don't go through it very often. And it's easy, like perhaps if you set up your machine 6 months ago or a year, you could have well forgotten many things, or someone didn't update the wiki page the last person someone got onboarded to the team. It's an infrequent action. It doesn't happen every day, so it's less important, or it feels less important for people to record how this happens.
Right.
Because they go through it and they're just glad to get it done. Like, it works, done, like I made it. And that isn't always reflected in new docs or other easier things for the next person.
Mm-hmm. And so of course Codespaces comes in there. So just if the viewers out there, if you don't know, Codespaces is called GitHub Codespaces, and I should put in a little banner here. You can go sign up to try it out. Request early access. I just posted the link for that. And it's basically and a complete development environment that is in the cloud. And what's really cool is that you could just use Visual Studio to connect to it. So you're still using your Visual Studio, but all the compute, all the compiling, debugging, testing, running is all in the cloud. And so all the SDKs and everything that you need in order to develop and run is also in the cloud. And you don't have it locally. And so, Andy, we're with Codespaces, we're kind of getting closer to having some sort of isolation of an environment that is different from what you have on your machine. And now you can have like these, you can have an infinite amount of these Codespaces, right? All set up with different configurations and so on. And so you can really start to do this type of work on a massive scale that was hard to do before. Does that solve the problem on its own?
Not on its own necessarily. I think one of the challenges is still that the local experience. Like Codespaces are fantastic, and like you mentioned, they provide these remote resources you can utilize and you can manage. But for many developers, for some time, and obviously GitHub Codespace is still in private previews. This is certainly true now. You need a local experience. You could, for very many reasons, a Codespace might not be the right choice for you. You could be in an environment like a regulated industry where it's not really appropriate to use those sort of resources. You could be working offline, or any other number of circumstances. So I think one of the things we want, we're trying to do, hopefully in the next update to Visual Studio, is make a local experience, because that's also the place where you start. Like clearly, if you're going to use a Codespace today, you have code, you have a repo somewhere in mind. You're probably not starting out from scratch. You probably have something, and the thing you want to do first is make it work locally. Like how do I encode this so just in your local environment, you get some value, and this also enables a great testing experience, because one of the challenges of the very first time you go through this experience of trying to create that definition, which we call a DevInit JSON file, which is just a JSON file that defines what your environment requires. One of the challenges, of course, is that you have to figure that out. Like, you have to experiment. It may seem obvious that like, I need these three things, but sometimes that might not be so obvious, and you might have to do a bit of discovery and figure out why it doesn't work. And the tools on Windows, like as you go through that process of discovery, as you go through trying to create your environment, on Windows, you have all these great tools. If it's, it's the event manager, the logs, or even the other places in Windows to discover and find out when things go wrong. So say something didn't install for the right reason, you can look at a log and do that. And that's great. And that's powerful, because one of the downsides right now, one of the limitations really of Codespaces is Visual Studio is your window into the world. Like if there's a literal window in Visual Studio, such as the terminal window or the Solution Explorer for listing files, etc., that's great. That gives you insight. But Visual Studio doesn't have, for example, a great way to view the application or event logs inside Windows. So creating the initial file, like that initial definition of your environment for your application locally, makes tons of sense, and using it locally also makes tons of sense. Much in the same way that, if you're familiar with VS Code, they have a similar story really for devcontainer.json, where you define a Linux container traditionally, which your application, the back end of VS Code is in, and that also works locally. And so there's this virtuous cycle of like building things that work locally, testing them, and then they can also be leveraged in the cloud by a greater number of people or in a greater number of scenarios.
So it sounds like devinit.json. So it's a configuration file you committed to your repo, so that if someone else clones your repo, then the information in devinit explains what the environment needs, what to install, and it also goes ahead and installs it. Is that right?
Not automatically. So like you said, there's this JSON file, and for Codespace, we include the devinit exe, like the command line tool. And we can execute a command, just devinit init. We're not very creative, I'm afraid. And then that takes that file, looking for it in a certain location, and executes what's in it. In fact, if you want to pull up the docs, maybe we can look at the docs, or we can look at a sample. Maybe that'll help.
Yeah.
So I think I have to relog into my machine.
Oh yeah, I just posted the docs link for people if they want to follow along.
Let me see if I can log in without.
Yeah, we'll see. What's up, brother? So I'm very excited for this, because I think it's going to change a lot of how everyone is doing their repos. and how easy it's going to be to onboard to open source, and also, of course, internally closed source in companies.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually one of the things that's really nice to mention that I hadn't yet, was the one of the challenges of contributing to open source repositories is, like you say, you go to GitHub, you can find no end of OSS, which is fantastic. You can clone it and get the source code easily, but sometimes building those things might be tricky.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I know the .NET team did some research with people who are contributing to the .NET Runtime open source repository, and one of the challenges there was that, they require installing 3 or 4 different tools, including certain versions of CMake and some build tools. So obviously there's native components to their project, and that's just a barrier. Like, and so trying to remove those barriers is not just simple to, like get the source, but also run the application, build the application, with or without without manual steps. So so this is an example taken from, if I just go to my, so this is obviously Visual Studio. We're connected to a Codespace, as you can see, this little like icon and notice here in the top. And what we've got is I can just run it. It's the .NET eShop on Web example. I've just forked it, but it's just the classic .NET. It's a classic .NET architecture sample app. It has .NET Core and uses SQL to store a database of items that you can purchase, like branded items like mugs and T-shirts. But it really just serves as an example of how to use some technologies.
And Andy, just to be clear, this concept here has nothing to do with what language you're using or anything like that. .NET, C++, JavaScript, whatever, right?
Yeah, so it does not. And to take a slight diversion onto that topic, like DevInit itself isn't meant to be dependent upon one thing or another thing. However, we do have a list of tools, and some of those tools, the things you can currently describe with DevInit, because an important thing to keep in mind is DevInit is brand new. We're only just working on it, so we focused on making it work for Codespace applications, so .NET Core and some CMake applications, some C++ app using Windows Subsystem for Linux. So on the docs here, which maybe we can post in the chat, you can see there's a list of all the tools. So you can use things like Chocolatey. And Chocolatey has like a package.config file where you can list out packages to install, and we'll just execute that. Because one of the things with DevInit, we don't want it to be another package distribution system. There's Wimget, AppScoop, Chocolatey. There's lots of these, both on Windows and elsewhere. And really, we just want this to be a place where you can bring what you already have. So if you already have Chocolatey, if you already have something else, you can bring it, and then you can just tell us in a static, a declarative JSON file, so we can discover that and do something with it and automate its deployment, and maybe even provide better tooling experiences later. So since it's targeted on .NET Core, you see we have some .NET-y stuff like installing .NET and enabling IIS. But there's also things, obviously, like making sure you got the right version of Node, since many applications obviously have a Node front ends, making sure the VS package or installing Visual Studio itself. So there's a few tools right now really focused around just enabling those ASP.NET Core apps and cross-platform C++ apps that are targeting like Windows Subsystem for Linux. And so if I go back to Visual Studio for a second and find the right one, what you can see is that in this case, we've got a JSON file. It's just called .devinit.json. And inside it, we just have a top-level property called run. And this is really speaks to, right now, DevInit.json is more like a tool runner, like it's a execution engine. Like it says install this, install this, install this, which is a bit different from like some installers where they're all about state management. So this is really just a list of stuff you think about. So a list of stuff, when you're using your app and you building it, your app thinks about. So here, for example, the first one we got is require the .NET Core SDK. So that might be kind of obvious, like, hey, like .NET Core, of course, we've got it here, but and Visual Studio obviously installs that. But an important thing to keep in mind is that you can't always, these repos, you want them to work outside Visual Studio even. You potentially want them to work elsewhere, or you can't necessarily depend on what Visual Studio might bring. So in this case, this tool, if I was to look at the documentation for this particular tool, what it would say is that this command is installing the latest. I have not put any inputs. There's just the single JSON statement of require this. And there's obviously options you can pass into the tool. So I could say specific versions, or I could say a specific channel, like the daily channel, etc., of the .NET Core SDK. So each of the tools themselves has a bunch of options, as you can see in the documentation. And one thing to note there is since in general DevInit isn't the actual isn't the one doing the work here, we're trying to make DevInit a very simple wrapper to something else. In this case, the require.NET Core SDK is just calling into the .NET install scripts. It's just the .NET install script that you might have used to install .NET Core, in a script file or in some other automated fashion. And so the next one is just using the .NET tool again to install the entity framework tools.
Well, before you go to the next one, just to understand. So if we take the first object in your run array, it just says required .NET Core SDK. Now, should I understand this as this is kind of a PowerShell commandlet that's being executed that's called required-.NET Core SDK?
You can think of it that way. It depends on each of the tools. So each of the particular tools has a different way. Like if we take something else, for example, we also have this simple tool to kind of install SQL Server, and that's actually doing something else. It's requiring some MSIs and some other things to install MS SQL. So I think it's kind of analogous to scripts, but it's different in the sense that what we've tried to do with by having a JSON file is we want to make simple things like basically automatable, like so simple to do that it's as easy as this. Like obviously, if you have a script, you can do so much more. Like there's no branching, there's no conditionals inside JSON files, or not practically. So this sort of tool, DevInit JSON, is really appropriate for those sort of static dependencies. But even inside this repo, if I just diverge for a second and talk about scripts, there's a bunch of commands I need to run. So I need to run some migrations. That's not really a great thing for a JSON file to do. That's more of the script that should happen like post you create the clone, after you've cloned the repo and acquired the dependencies. So like with DevInit, we're really trying to make it so that the 80% case, like if you just want to plain old IIS, it's one, it's just enable IIS. That's it.
Right.
Now I'm sure many of you have seen IIS configuration scripts that can run into hundreds of lines, if not more. So as you have complicated dependencies, that's where you have to really think about either reusing the system you have. Like some people might have used like a Octopus or some other technology to deploy IIS, and that's basically an MSI. And so there's a tool for running MSIs and stuff like that. So like these built-in tools are really designed to just do that. Like, hey, what's the 80%, like the common scenario that's easily enabled? For things that are more complex, like especially take IIS, which has more options, there's entire tool chains built around that. It's best to use whatever tool chain is for that environment. And then you can just start it from here,
right.
Rather than have. Oh yeah, go ahead, sir.
What I really like about the sort of the declarative approach, because it could just have been a PowerShell file that does this, right?
Yeah, it could have. Yep.
Is that this is toolable? Like you
Yeah,
get
that's the main
intelligence here,
reason.
but you can, like what you were mentioning in the future, you could imagine like some pretty advanced tooling on top of this to make it even easier and simpler.
Yeah, you get IntelliSense just thanks to the JSON schema. You can see all the tools here and things like that. And so, like you said, that is one of the other main reasons for it to be a JSON script. Is it's easier for Visual Studio to interact with, easier for other tools and systems to interact with. Whereas a PowerShell script or any other scripting language, you just run it and you hope for the best.
So you actually just showed us a PowerShell script that calls DevInit.
Yep.
And so in your repo is the instructions you give to people that clone your repo for the first time, is that basically just to say
run this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's it. There's two kind of things here. One is that, in the code space, DevInit is on path, so you can call it from the terminal or wherever. And in this case, if you want to just install or execute the stuff in this JSON file, you just run DevInit init like that. And you can see it's going ahead and, in this case, it's already installed since I ran this before. But you can see it just goes ahead and executes those steps. And that's, just one simple command. Again, fairly straightforward. There's options to pass in like a different path to a JSON file. We look in certain locations by default. Mm-hmm. So if I was to go to another location where there isn't one, let's just use source, and you're going to get an error message now. These are the paths we look in by default.
Okay. So it doesn't look up the folder hierarchy? No,
it doesn't, because currently our thinking was that you might have a repo that actually has many projects in, mm-hmm. And perhaps you want some at a certain time and things like that. So rather than just, that's actually something we are thinking about, should it? But for now, it's like we look in those certain directories, kind of similar to the dev container that existed, customizations that existed for Codespaces already. And yeah, then the second part is so it's not enough often for a repo just to run DevInit in it. Like, maybe we can flip it around so DevInit in it runs scripts. Maybe that's actually the right way. But today, like this particular repo, you have to do some other things. You have to run some NZ framework migrations, which is
and that's very common. Like you run migrations, for instance, after clone. Yeah.
So you can imagine.
Is there a way that you could tell, like could Visual Studio tell whether or not you've ever run the DevInit? So let's say you open a solution for the first time right after clone, and it's like, would it be able to recognize, hey, you haven't run this? It doesn't know. I can imagine that it doesn't know whether or not you have everything installed, because only DevInit, when you run it, will figure that out, I guess. But then offer you to run it, so that to take that sort of human error aspect out of it.
Yeah, so that's actually one of the things we're talking about now, and is the interaction with Visual Studio, essentially. Like we have a similar experience today. If you open up a solution, you don't have some projects, you don't have like some workloads. We say like, hey, can you go get these latest things in that little gold bar in the Solution Explorer? And so we're thinking of similar things and other things similar, where it's like, hey, this DevInit JSON, we found this DevInit JSON, like, let's run it, or if it's already been ran, and to really get to the point where, hey, your application defines its dependencies, and we want Visual Studio to respect that. We want Visual Studio to install the right version. This is especially true if you think of things like C++, which have traditionally had many different, like we're on version 142 of the C++ toolset. You want to set your app should tell us what it needs, and so Visual Studio can make sure it requires it, because the next app used with Visual Studio, the same Visual Studio, might require an older or newer version of the toolset. And you want to make sure that the one version we install with VS, you obviously maybe you install all of them and suffer gigabytes of installer, but the thing we install with VS might not actually be the thing you need. So you tell us, and we can go ahead and acquire that for you. So it just works on F5. So rather than have the experience of brand new Visual Studio, older C++ app, F5's like, oops, in compiler error, missing. You perhaps use some new feature that's awesome, like some coroutine and C++ 20 or something like that. But it's not available, of course, in the older tool sets.
Don't we have like a feature like that already? You can right click and say generate configuration script or
yeah. So for Visual Studio, we do. So there's this concept called VS config files. And so exactly. In fact, you can do it if.
How do you do it? Let's see it.
Yeah. Let me just. Oops. Sorry. Let me go to the right window on my computer. So if we just go to the installer in Visual Studio, so this is all about like if you've got Visual Studio and you're happy with it and it works for your application, one thing you can do is you can export a configuration file. And this config file, let's just copy that.
And it's called .vsconfig? It
is, and you'll see it in some repositories. And yeah, if I just put it here for now and then open the file, what it does is it takes not that file. Sorry, using Hyper-V locally. Right. Yeah, it's all about VMs these days. Especially sorry, this is the Codespace. Wrong version of Visual Studio. I need the local version of Visual Studio, since I just saved it locally. Yeah, so what it does is it exports all the components. So when you create a VS install, you may or may not notice that each of these workloads is basically a collection of components, which is listed here. And this, you can see, for example, here the C++ libs, and so each of these drives that selection. And so when you've selected whatever you have here, basically that creates this list of components. And they can include extensions and other things, but for now it's all driven around like VS components. And so if you open up you put this .vs config in the root of your repo or next to your solution file, what will happen in here is if you open up a project and you don't have one of these components installed, we'll pop something saying like, oh, you should install something. So it allows you to define which components to install. And this can be checked into a repo today. And in fact, DevInit can drive this too. So there's a feature, a tool in DevInit called require VS component, which basically it just takes the VS config file, which we just talked about, and makes sure that all those components are installed.
So we got a question here. Is this a new preview feature?
It's not part of the project. It's just part of Codespaces right now.
No, the VS Config thing.
Oh no, this has been around for a few iterations now.
So VS Config came to an update of Visual Studio 2019.
Yeah, it's in all versions of 2019.
Like update 3, all versions.
I think so. I thought it was okay. Off the top of my head, definitely any recent version.
Well, this is pretty interesting. So, is there a reason that we won't always have this? That means that everyone that clones your repo, a new employee or someone open source or whatever, clones your repo, they will automatically be prompted to install the things that are needed to run your app of what ships within Visual Studio. What is
yeah, exactly. So like the way to think about this is if, regardless of Codespaces, and I think Sujin's going to come and do a talk on your show, so not to steal all her thunder, but regardless of Codespaces, if you just have a VS config, that makes sure that whoever clones that repo can get the right VS components. And so really DevInit is trying to solve not just the VS component aspect of it, because obviously there's many dependencies of your application that aren't VS components.
So VS components becomes like a provider to DevInit, just like Chocolatey and NPM and whatever, .NET, CLI and stuff like that.
Yeah, just like on the Linux Codespaces where they just call NPM install, that's what we do. It's like, hey, you obviously got a package.json, let's just call NPM install. All the DevInit JSON is trying to do is to, rather than rely on inference, like, hey, you've got a package.json, it must be NPM, just, tell us so that we can make sure that the environment is provisioned with Node. Because that's the thing to install. It doesn't come everything everywhere, especially if you want to reduce the size of your image.
Yeah, right. Okay, so that. This actually helps me clarify like sort of the difference with DevInit. Kind of sits on top of that and is sort of the orchestrator a little bit.
Yep.
But it doesn't do any of the installations itself. It just calls into like existing providers.
Yep. And so, if there's errors in those existing providers. So you should follow the same, like Stack Overflow results just for that. Like because that's part of the reason, like the installation space is complex. Like on Windows, installing software and maintaining it is a difficult challenge. And everyone's obviously solved it for their own particular application. And so DevInit isn't trying to replace any of those things. It's just trying to enable those things, to drive those things and make them aware to tools, make it toolable, so things like Visual Studio can interact with it.
So let's get a comment here. From Laurent. He says, nevertheless, I automated installation of my machine so that I can install all tools with one click on a hyperlink. I've known people that have done this before, colleagues and whatnot, and they, they have this utils folder, and there's a PowerShell script that does all sorts of fancy stuff, and Chocolatey is running to install it. Is DevInit kind of attempting to be that for the whole machine?
Not really. Like, I think there's obviously many ways on Windows, especially, that people provision environments, especially if you think about just an image like an OS. Like your enterprise provisions them for things like remote deployment services or other tools. And so DevInit is not trying to replace those. It's trying to enable repo specific environments. So it's trying to say hey, this repo needs these things. Like it's not what your machine, like for example, this website uses icons. I use paint.net to edit those icons. DevInit actually doesn't specify that. It doesn't say go install paint.net. You could through Chocolatey if you wanted to. But it's really about the customizations for a specific repo. So yes, you can create an environment in one pod at a time. It has all sorts of tools and all sorts of amazing stuff. But maybe you check out this other repo from GitHub and you don't have something from that repo that you would otherwise need. You would need, sorry.
I really like that because, when I get a new machine or I pay for my existing machine, which happens more often than I want to, there are some things that I know that I need to install kind of immediately.
No.
But then a lot of things I install as I need them. Like paint.net is an example. I don't use it every week. I actually use it quite a bit.
Yeah.
Camtasia, there's all these things. I install them as I need them. And what I really like about the DevInit version is that, I don't need to install something unless I need to clone that repo that has the dependency.
Yeah.
And so that keeps my machine, I feel like maybe a little bit leaner.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I certainly, like you said, you build up craft over the time. I've gone to start up more than once in Task Manager. I'm like, hey, why has this been running? Why has this been installed?
Right.
What's this for? But so really DevInit is really driven around the needs of a repo, essentially. It's the whatever's, and then the tools that interact with it, like Visual Studio, or if you think of Codespaces as a tool, in the sense that tools just software, it enables the the programmatic driving of that, so that you can create these environments, provision them without people doing stuff.
Right. And so are you able, through DevInit, to also control the version of Visual Studio itself in the code space?
So not a Visual Studio in the code space. So like in the code space that we're trying to move this model where we've decoupled your application dependencies from the Visual Studio dependencies. So for example, if your app needs, library foo or bar, that doesn't matter in terms of what Visual Studio needs. So like in terms of like, hey, the Visual Studio can constantly keep updating and not touch that foo bar application that you depended upon. So, like our hope is to get to a place where Codespaces for Visual Studio can update much more frequently and painlessly. Like you as a developer will just see new features as we deploy them. And since, there's no, from your perspective, no deployment or management of the code space in terms of Visual Studio, it just lights up and, it allows us as the service owners to, roll back, update, things like that. Much more easily than you would with Visual Studio, because in the long-term, the crazy future, one of the challenges I think we have with just installation and setup of Visual Studio is it's kind of an onerous process, like installing VS. It's not. I don't think anyone's described it as lightweight. Even today with Codespaces, the specific workloads for Visual Studio can be installed in 5 minutes. It still requires admin, touches program files, and it's still a couple of gigs. So hopefully, with this, we can start to separate out what your app needs versus what Visual Studio needs.
That's amazing. So we can stay on what we call on tip, or have the evergreen always on the latest. And it will be backwards compatible with whatever app we're working on, because they're two separate concepts. How can that even be? Is it like because you're separating the UI of Visual Studio away from sort of the underlying data logic or something like that?
Yeah, and using some of the like side-by-side capabilities of the underlying systems. So for example, like the perhaps easiest example is whenever you run a native C++ app, there's a C++ runtime. And so there's a couple of versions of ways you can deploy that. One, you can have it OS-wide in program files. And so like, hey, Visual Studio needed version 10, but you needed version 5, whoopsie. We're now fighting and arguing over that. And obviously there's incompatibility. Either you bring your app forward or Visual Studio supports down to whatever version your app required. So for C++, that's solved with an app local version of, you can also statically link it, but typically app local, so the process decides which version. So, hey, your app can require X, version 5, we require 10, our worlds don't need to meet. And you can imagine that this is the sort of like scenario that has to play out with other tools, like just separating out some of the dependencies from Visual Studio. So, if like your app doesn't deploy in your customer's site with Visual Studio, and we might have seen a couple of people who have deployed like some of the device and driver SDKs. But you don't need those things. That's just for development time. And so your app depends upon them. In Visual Studio, we shouldn't fight over the same dependencies.
Does that mean that all the components within Visual Studio have to be brought to be like running in their own process instead of within the Visual Studio Dev and Vexy in order for that to happen?
Not necessarily. Like the C++ app local thing, like it's a much more thing. There is a very separate idea that you've seen in recent releases of Visual Studio of separating out things into separate processes for memory. So for example, in the debugger, we moved part of the C++ debugger into its own process, really around symbols, the part that interacted with symbols, so that you can have multiple gigabytes, much more than the 32-bit process that Visual Studio would support while debugging. So this came up because it asked from customers, debugging big apps. Like imagine you have a game, imagine you're debugging Chromium, or an application that even embeds Chromium, and there's an application that's big itself. You can easily have like 2-3 gigabytes of symbols, and Visual Studio just couldn't support those. So there's a separate process, separate intent in Visual Studio, way out of the scope of this, to move workloads to separate processes where one, they have the space to do what they need to do and their own destiny, but also even things like benefits like reliability. Like if that debugger component goes down, then maybe you stop debugging, but you haven't lost any unsafe state in Visual Studio. You've not crashed Visual Studio, and you can potentially just restart the debugger process.
Or Visual Studio can automatically start it up again, maybe.
Maybe
you don't even notice that there was a crash somewhere.
Yeah, like especially in case of language services and stuff like that, where there's not any human interaction to start the thing anyway. So there's definitely a separate intent of essentially distributing the compute workload for Visual Studio outside of one process into multiple. And I think you've seen that for years now at this point.
Yeah, we've been moving more and more stuff out of proc, as we call it, and it's really interesting to see that trend just continuing.
Yeah.
So I want to get back because you mentioned one thing when you showed the VS config.
Yeah.
You said that here are a list of all the components and some of the extensions.
Yeah.
So are extensions supported today?
Not in Codespaces.
But there aren't VS config running locally.
I've got to double check this, but I thought you could use the marketplace ID to specify extensions.
Okay, and I assume so.
This is like I haven't checked, so now I'm like, thought that was the case. Now I'm going to regret saying this.
Well, because I know that it's not fully extended because there's two ways that Visual Studio installs extensions.
Yes, per user per machine.
Yes.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those two? Like, why is one handled by one installer and why is one handled by another?
I'm not too sure the reasons. God, this is way before my time, sort of thing. But there is a separate like V6 installer that handles like installations of V6s, which is the packaging format, the like OPC or the open publishing compound. What Office call that OPC format? It's a zip library. Like you just rename it .zip and it works great. Just don't. But anyway, it just has some metadata to differentiate it from zip files. Anyway, so that there's like a per user mode where an extension is installed just for that customer, so it doesn't require elevation to install. And then there's another mode which does require elevation, requires you to run as administrator, which is machine-wide because it touches program files and places like that. I'm honestly not too sure how we ended up with two separate mechanisms, but the rationale for the two versions is that imagine you're provisioning a machine for use in an enterprise. You can't do, all your settings are typically per machine because obviously users will come later on and log in. So it's valuable to have like a per machine setup and configuration that can be rolled out to multiple people, regardless of how many people use this actual physical machine. Luckily, we all live in an environment where whenever user logs into a machine, but at the time of provisioning, who knows what that user is going to be? So you can't just provision it; you have to provision it to the machine account. And
so even if it did work, it would only work if you listed per machine extensions, and there's no way to tell when you're like, unless you can try to install an extension, and if it asks you to elevate to accept the UAC prompt to run as admin while you install it, then it would work. Otherwise, it wouldn't work. So there is that. But if you have your own extensions developed internally in-house, just make them a per machine. It's literally a checkbox on before you compile your extension, and then it works. So that's an interesting one. But that's all coming. That's all. Is the idea that it's coming to DevInit to support that, or is it a VS Config feature only? Or
so the extension story actually we're kind of trying to figure out with the extension. Well, the extension team is trying to figure out their story for Codespaces. So that will kind of determine some of the requirements here. So we haven't figured out how all the extensions fit into DevInit and things like that, and that's one of the open areas. Just as we figure out, what the story for extensions is. Period. Like it makes no sense to build an install of something that doesn't exist.
Right. So is there a way today that you can, like, because I think the majority of people are, they haven't tried Codespaces yet. So is there a way that they can use? We know they can use VS Config, but can they also use DevInit locally today?
Not right now. So we are right now, DevInit only exists as part of the GitHub Codespace for Visual Studio, but shipping it in a version of Visual Studio is like something I want to do in the next release. Not promising that.
Like the next major, like Visual Studio 2000 and...
Sorry, the next minor update.
Oh, so that would be 16.8, 16.9?
16.9. Yeah.
Do we know when that's coming?
Not yet. I don't know. It'll hopefully be somewhere early in the new year.
Okay. What will it be in the first preview of 16.9?
That depends very much. It's something, like I said, we're working on.
Okay. So I'm just trying to when can we get to play with?
Hoping someone could just put the exe up on the internet. No, I'm joking.
Yes.
No, it's because one of the things is also the distribution. Like, in Codespaces, to be honest, we have DevInit and all those separate tools are separate plugins, DLLs, assemblies that are loaded. But perhaps the local distribution should be a single exe. Using the .NET Core single exe stuff, which will make it much more deployable and manageable because you can just copy it, etc. Right. So there's still some thinking to be done, but by and large, it's targeting the next preview.
But the idea was when you were in a Codespace, you had DevInit was on the path. So in the terminal, you can just say DevInit and then init. is the idea that if you're using the developer prompt locally, that it would also just be the same?
Yeah, certainly in the developer prompt, I think there's good debates to be had if we should modify system path, because it's something Visual doesn't do today.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, right. It doesn't.
So the developer prompt for sure, and that's the interesting. I mean, I add dev to my path, just like codes on path and other things are on path because I'm a lazy developer. But like, and I use command line tools to go like, dev end, name the solution. But for long reasons that are probably lost in time, VS doesn't add itself to a system path.
I know, but dev end exe is not there. MS build is not there.
Not there. None of them are there.
None of them are there. Yeah,
it's very different from a lot of other command line tools. Like I think people would be pretty mad if npm didn't put itself on path.
Right. Well, I'm looking forward to you making that happen, Andy. Thank you so much for promising it here.
Yes, adding everything to path. Every single binary that Visual Studio ships will add to path.
No, just the one I need.
Yes, you can add it to your path anytime.
Yes.
In fact, Windows has improved the UI for that. It's much easier now.
They have. I love it.
It's a new UI that's much better than before. You don't have to figure out like a long string.
Yep. I really like the name you have, like DevInit and then init, DevInit init. It reminds me of Ali G.
Oh God. Yeah, but it wasn't even a play on cloud in it or anything like that. Like it was just.
Is it the final name?
I hadn't heard of any thoughts about changing it.
Okay.
So who knows? If anyone wants to suggest a better name, feel free to write it in. Maybe. But
I feel like there's a challenge here to the audience in like who can come up with a meme for a DevInit init.
Yeah, it's a deception meme.
Yeah. I love it. So okay, so I think we answered this question.
Yeah.
If there's a timeline for DevInit, okay, so it's coming in what's going to be 16.9, which doesn't have a date yet, but soonish.
Yeah.
Soonish.
Next preview.
That doesn't even mean anything, does it? What does that mean?
It doesn't. In 2020, who knows?
Yeah.
Let's hope we get through the end of the year.
Yeah, right. Okay, so here's one from Matthew. Are there plans for Codespaces to support full framework, or is it .NET Core only?
So today it's .NET Core only, and you should definitely reach out to the .NET team to provide feedback around like what you want to do with full frameworks or apps you have in mind. Like I think Kendra might be a great person to read, like Got Heap on Twitter. Might be a good person to connect to.
I'm just gonna put that out there. Got Heap.
Oh, yeah, I think that's Kendra's Twitter handle.
I think so.
If not, whoever that is, just got a bunch of.
Remove it. Okay. Okay. Yeah. Because that's the funny thing, right? So the with most things in Visual Studio. So both Andy and myself work on the Visual Studio platform team. So we're basically just making APIs for all these other teams to build their features, for the .NET team to build the C# editor and the C# debugging feature and all this sort of stuff. And the same is true for Codespaces, right? You're creating the building blocks, and then these other teams, they light up their scenarios as they get to it, and as demand rises and all this sort of stuff. So right now, .NET Core only, and C++ and CMake.
Yeah,
right?
So the idea is for like cross-platform apps. CMake is just a tool like MS Build that drives other compilers, if that's the C++ compiler, the GNU compiler, or whichever compiler you want to use. But it's typically used like cross-platform apps, like big ones, like Chromium uses it, for example, and small ones. But those sort of applications, specifically ones if they run on Linux, like the C++ team does a lot of great work in enabling Linux targeting. So if you have a C++ app that runs on Linux, you can use the Windows subsystem for Linux, and DevInit can provision that for you, so you get the right version of Ubuntu or whatever Linux device, OS you're using, whatever distro, and whatever tools you need in that environment. So yeah, the cross-platform Linux story is where it'd be super exciting to see if people can check it out.
That's pretty sweet. Okay, so we have .NET. So when we say .NET Core, what do we mean? Do we mean ASP.NET only? Do we mean .NET Core 3.1 only? What about 5? And
so we don't mean so. The biggest thing is we do mean things like, not like, for example, the UI stack, not client applications. We mean like ASP.NET or any sort of like terminal, like command line driven application, since that works in Codespaces, as well as libraries and stuff like that, obviously. So anything that you think of as running in the service or a server, it works best in Codespaces.
You can do UI, right? Don't we have the app casting where it basically shows you the running app?
Only for Microsoft employees right now.
Okay, so that's coming.
That's a coming thing, yeah. So
okay.
Right now our target is all on ASP.NET, which is obviously a huge, like, anything you can port forward, that works great. Yeah, ASP.NET, yeah.
Okay. Well, that's a good one. Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that. Actually, that'd be good. So here's a completely unrelated question.
Yeah.
Okay. As a beginner developer, what is the diagnostics tools that I need to learn and start with?
That's an interesting question. I try to think, like, I don't know if it's a tool, like, as much as a technique. Like, one thing I've always found useful when learning stuff is to see how stuff works. Like, I was the sort of kid that used to break open toys. Like, we used to have a speak and spell as a kid. I swear to God, I broke that thing open and destroyed it just to see how it worked, which none of my parents, no one appreciated that. So, like, for software, like, just using the debugger, like setting a breakpoint and running the application and stepping. Like, just the basics, like set a breakpoint somewhere interesting in the code and step from there and see what happens. See what sort of things it does. Like, how does it pass data from one point to another point? How does it make use of, how to construct objects? What sort of, like, later on you can translate these, like, view models, all those fun terms. But just really step and explore. Like, look at the call stack, see who calls who. Like, see how the app is constructed just by experiencing it, especially if it's a simple app that isn't particularly well multi-threaded. There's a lot of learning to be had just with a simple breakpoint and using the watch windows to inspect variables and see the state. In Visual Studio, there's all sorts of advanced tools as well that, you probably don't need to start. Like the parallel stacks shows a view of, like, hey, you've got 40 threads, 50 tasks. Here's a view of that. But just stepping in and understanding how data is passed is a huge thing.
I love that. Use debugging and diagnostics to explore the code base and learn.
Yeah,
that's fantastic. I think a lot of people do that, like, without even noticing, because usually when you're onboarding to a new code base, it's either to fix a bug or to add a feature or something like that, and so that you probably end up doing that, even though you didn't start out with that in mind.
It's always the first thing I do. Like, if I ever have a bug on out, like, if there's a piece of UI displayed with a string, I look for that string, the definition of that string, and then I hunt down where that is and where that string is used.
Yeah.
And set breakpoints and then just see how it gets to that part.
Ah, clever. Okay, so here's another question. Are there any taxes on cross-platform apps?
I know nothing of tax.
Well, I think taxes. So
I know.
Ellie, by taxes, do you mean like, does it slow down the system when you're do you use more resources on the system when you're doing cross-platform apps on Codespaces? Because if that's the case, then that shouldn't be any different than if you did it locally on WSL2 and stuff like that.
Yeah, like, I think that the case is all, like, it depends, like, what specific scenarios you had in mind. But yeah, the like the WSL thing that I was just talking about with Windows Subsystem for Linux and C++, it's just the same as running it locally. I mean, there are obviously the aspect of Codespaces itself is remotable, but that's no different.
Yeah, right. Okay. I think that concludes not just the open questions, but also the full hour.
Cool.
Andy, thank you so much for helping me understand how this DevInit works.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
All right. And everybody out there, see you next Monday for another episode. And I'm looking forward to it. Take care, everybody.